We'd like to hear it. Wait, really? Did they really?
Well, hey, at least you're here, and that's what counts. So, hey, we left off last time. Oh yeah, by the way, it is April the 9th, and this is our dual credits, 1302 history, U.S. And so we left off last time. We were talking about the Mexican-American War, and we had just talked about, oh, we got past this. Yeah, we had just talked about the taking of Mexico City by U.S. forces, and then they're going to have a peace treaty. So if you want to have peace, you got to have treaties. Treaties are international law where two countries come up with an agreement on terms of peace. This is going to be the first, this peace treaty is going to be the first time that I'm aware of in world history where the winners actually pay the people who lost the war. So it's going to be one of the strange things.
We take the land.
Yeah, we took the land and we paid for it.
We took the land, we were like, okay, yeah, we'll pay for it.
But usually it doesn't take the land, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the main reasons why, there's two main reasons why I think that the land that was ceded from Mexico remained in U.S. hands for so long without much of a rebellion. I think number one is they were largely unpopulated, and the people who were there were just willing to turn sides anyways. That was true. The second part is a lot of the land was unknown, like what was in it, and a lot of it was barren. Like a lot of Arizona, New Mexico, going up from there, they were like, it's desert. It's just dirt. Whereas California was good land, but it goes back to there weren't a lot of people there, except for, of course, Native Americans, missionaries, and some ranchers. So I think because it wasn't really ingrained and populated. All right, so next one. All right, so the Mexican-American War continued. As General Scott reached Mexico City. Dang, how did it go backwards? There it is. All right. So after taking Mexico City, we had that treaty I was talking about, the Treaty of Guadalupe. So negotiations for the treaty were further hampered by language. Remember, I mentioned this last time. Americans didn't speak Spanish, and the Mexicans didn't speak English. But, however, they both understood French. Like I said, French and Latin were very commonly taught during this time period. French was like the international language of trade and education, and Latin was considered a basic language just for it helps out with grammar and of course, like it was just seen as something you do in Western culture. In the treaty, signed February the 2nd, 1848, Mexico gave up all claims on Texas above the Rio Grande River. So they agreed upon the border that Texas and America said was the border. And they ceded New Mexico and California to the U.S. for $15 million. Technically, Mexico gave up all land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River and between there to the Pacific. So you see that water boundaries made natural, just kind of like lines for this. Polk, however, was angry. He actually wanted to cede all of Mexico. However, most of the nation was strongly against that. There's several reasons why the nation was against it. Some was that some of the anti-war argument hit home. A lot of people are like, wow, we really don't want to be conquerors and conquer a people, because that's what those pesky Romans did, and they turned out to be bad guys. That's what Napoleon did, and he was a bad guy. So like a lot of people who were very unpopular, or nations who were very unpopular, they're like, well, we can't do that. It's not what a Judeo-Christian people do. That goes against liberty. That goes against the ideas of the American Revolution, to be free from a foreign power. We would have become that foreign power, right? Another had to do with language barrier, cultural differences, At this time, Catholicism was kind of growing in like the eastern part of America, not that much, but Mexico was like almost entirely Catholic. And so you had a Protestant Catholic divide. And of course, some of it had to do with just old-fashioned racism, right? So, like Americans didn't want to de-Anglicize America. And during the 1840s, racism is becoming more and more of one of those things that's going to solidify, especially between Black and white people, once the question of emancipation comes up. And so, yeah, so you're going to see highly racist arguments come up in order to try to justify slavery. So it's like it's becoming more and more bitter and pseudoscientific, more just full of vitriol and stuff like that as a way of justification. And we will get to that for the Civil War. So, it's going to bring up questions. So, what do we do with this land? Go back to slavery. We're going to be slave states, free states. What are we going to do? Also, they're going to start playing with the idea of California is going to be so popular with the 49ers, and we're going to have improved functionality of like railroads and steam engines. Like, well, let's have a transcontinental railroad. Where should it go? Well, I want it to go through my state because they'll make my state a lot of money. Well, I want it to go through my state because they'll make my state a lot of money.
Make it through every state.
Make it through every state. Just there we go. Just zigzag up and down. All right.
Efficiency.
Yes. All right. So sectionalism and slavery. Our next unit, we are going to talk a bit about the developing sectionalism, the differences between North and South. They're going to come up. So, Guadalupe is going to talk a lot about this. I would have you read his stuff, but the thing is, I would rather have an excerpt reader because it's actually quite a large book, and I think it would take a lot of your time going through it. But as a French politician, or maybe as a bureaucrat, he came down from the French Republic to essentially. He was paid to study our people, like what was right about America and what was wrong. And so one of the things that's going to be the most blaringly obvious thing to him is that the North, when he visits it, is going to be completely different culturally from the South, so much so it's like the North and South are two separate countries. The lifestyles, attitudes towards things like work and charity and religion are all going to be different, right? The differences between honor and combat. He's going to like notice all of these things, but he's also going to say some good things about how the system worked out so well in industry, innovation. So, before the Mexican-American War, the issue of slavery was divisive. After the war, Americans found themselves further on one side of the issue or the other. So we're seeing it's polarizing people. In your life, you will see political and moral up into the public and popular sphere that will grow and grow. And as they grow, they will divide people. They often nowadays divide people across party lines. The same could be said back then, but back then it was also more territorial. Like I said, North and South were observed as if they were two separate countries. Since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, many in the North began to believe that a slave oligarchy ruled the South and sought to control the rest of the country. So this is we're going to talk more about the Missouri Compromise later on in our next little section. But you're going to start having misunderstandings between one another. And so slave oligarchy. An oligarchy has to do with the rule of a few people. It's like, it could be seen as kind of like not necessarily the best people. It could be like the richest people, right? So like when you looked at the South, it was like something like less than 10% of the people there owned most of the slaves. And so these were super rich, giant plantation owners, whereas most of the other white American citizens were rather poor. They didn't own any slaves. And a lot of the wealth, something like 90%, went up to like the top 3%. I need to find my charts. I have data on this. And so in the South, most of the money was owned by just a few people. And those few people owned all the slaves, most of the land, all this other stuff. And so in the North, they saw this group of elite rich people basically ruling the South as if it was like a little oligarchy, kind of like the Spartans, right? That's where we get the term from. But and in the South, we're going to see conspiracies develop where they are going to view the Northerners as essentially trying to push freedom for Black people so hard that there's going to be Southerners who are going to push propaganda that there's going to be like forced marriages between the races and all this other kinds of crazy stuff that nobody was talking about back then. But it was propaganda. It was trying to shape one side or another. Furthermore, they believe that slave labor only hurt the wages of the working class, Americans, and made for unfair competition. So in the South, they're like, whoa, you think we're so bad with slavery? But up north in your factories, you're paying people pennies in filthy conditions. And then you're having them live 5 families to an apartment with no running water, no sewage. They're like, well, that sounds pretty bad. You have kids working in factories and they're getting chewed up in the machinery. How good are you? So they're like, there's a point to that. They also thought that slavery led to expansionist wars like the one in Mexico. So, and well, we saw the war with Mexico. And so a lot of people didn't want to participate in the war with Mexico because they saw it as an expansionist war. They're like, you're taking people's land for slavery. But I explained the point above. I actually explained the Southern point of view. Believe that slave labor only hurts the wages of working class. That was the Northern view. And by that, they mean, if I'm a bricklayer, how am I supposed to compete laying bricks when you have somebody who does it for free? You can't. The only way for you to compete is to like do it for free. Person to lay the bricks, right? You can't make your wages any lower than that. And so it destroys a free market, which was never perfect in America, but it was always one of these things that was kind of championed as a goal. You can go out there and live the American dream and you can make it, you can work your way up. But you can't do that if your labor has no value. If your labor has no value and everything you do is worthless, then you're just as bad as a slave. All right, so it's technically the last part of this unit. So we're done with the westward expansion. The one I have for industry and sectionalism, super small. It's only like 12 slides. So we're going to be able to do this one today and May, and on Wednesday, we're going to have that test. And the test is going to be over everything since our last test. So it's going to be what? Andrew Jackson, westward expansion, and now sectionalism. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to download this as a PDF. I'm going to upload it in Google Classroom. We're going to make it through some of this. So let's see. And open up the Google Classroom. Our U.S. history.
I'm looking up why it's called this funny little custom.
Material. Let's see. Keys are sticking. All right, this is under industry notes in dual credit. I'm going to upload the file so that you can find that and follow along. Here it is. Cool. All right. Yeah, so this is a relatively short little unit. I put it together because this has a lot of things that show this is going to help outline some of the difference between North and South, but some of the many reasons why the North is going to defeat the South. The South, yes, it had characteristics of an oligarchy in that you can think of it as something like an aristocracy. So what's an aristocracy? An aristocracy is the idea that the best people are in charge. You can think of it like nobility, right? The nobility are supposed to be the ones with the most money, the most education, the most refinement, the best nutrition, and they learn certain skills that the other commoners don't have. Well, when you look at the population in the South, yeah, it's kind of like that. Only the rich could go to school. In the South, they hardly had any schools. So you would have to send your kids off. Well, who had the money to do that? Well, it was the major plantation owners. And what did they want to do to go to school for? Well, a lot of it was to go learn how to lead in warfare and stuff. In the South, they had a much stronger fighting culture. Whereas in the North, you're going to see a culture more based around the idea of, making money and having a living and things like that. A lot of it has to do with innovation, working with your hands, small farming, things like that. So they're going to have amazing leadership at first in the South. But in the North, they got a lot more people. They got a lot more money. Almost all the banks are in the North. All of the gun manufacturers are in the North, not to mention the factories. All the railroads are there, so they can send stuff faster. Not only that, their railroads work with each other. So they're going to have standard gauges. So the train from one company can ride on the tracks of another. In the South, they're going to be a little pieced together. You might have some with like a wide gauge and some with a short gauge. And guess what? A train with one set of wheels can't go on a wider track or a more narrow track. It's not how they work. So that's going to be some really big problems for the South. All right, so here's some terms. If you don't know the meaning of a term, please write down its definition. But I think a lot intuitive, right? So like industrialization, the process of economic development based on factory production, right? Industry, factory, it goes hand in hand. Mechanization, using machines in the production of the process. Well, yeah, once again, it's intuitive. Mechanization, machines. And so that's one of the things that we're really going to see in the North, and it's going to take more time to spread into the South. Like I told you, in the South, most of the economy was tied to the plantation system, and specifically to cotton and slavery. Well, you don't have to innovate if you don't have a reason to innovate. Technology is innovation. It reduces the need for manpower because a machine's doing it. In the South, they had people do it. I didn't really worry about it. Investment in that direction seemed like a waste of money. If you're a rich plantation owner, your investment would be to buy more slaves or more land or something like that. So keep in mind, factory and city locations were determined due to geography. Railroads began to greatly reduce these restrictions, however. So why geography? Well, for one, the most important natural resource is a river. A river can supply water, sometimes even power source for a factory, especially early factories when they had like water mills and stuff like that. But that was more of a European thing. But of course, boats can haul like a lot of tonnage for relatively cheap. And if you look back to ancient civilizations, building your cities next to a source of water was just normal. You got to drink, you got to travel. So you built next to a river, lake, ocean, something like that. But railroads, because of cheap transportation, means you can have your city away from these things, and your commodities can be shipped. Instead of just going north and south, railroads make it really cheap to go east and west too. So that's going to be really important for that westward expansion we were talking about in the last unit. Cities and cities need to access rivers or canals. Roads were few, and the ocean. We had good harbors. So that's one of the reasons why in the Northeast in particular, it's going to be a really good place for those colonists to come. The good harbor, got some rivers around there, but our roads are going to be kind of crappy for a long time. Roads, we won't have good incentive to have good roads really until the automobile. Most Americans tended to work in agriculture. That was North and South. And often they did not wish to work for the low wages offered by factory owners. Like I said, some of those Southern critics had a point by calling it slave wages, slave capitalism. It's because really you didn't work that well for that much money, but they needed cheap labor. And that cheap labor led to an influx of immigration from Europe and the British Isles. And so you're going to have factory owners like, oh man, I really want to get richer. I have this product, but nobody wants to work for me. But you might have countries overseas where they have a surplus population with nothing to do. They're destitute, and they're willing to do anything to send money back home to help their families. So you get some immigration. Which we will get back to. We will get back to that. All right, so the railroads. Prior to the Civil War, railroads were already beginning to transform the landscape. So all this is building up to the Civil War, remember. I think I need to add a couple of things here because I think I need to go back and add some things that have to do with immigration because this stuff that has to do with immigration, a lot of this was happening before the Mexican-American War. Or it's like, there's a lot of Irish immigrants from the Irish potato famine, and I need to add something about that. In fact, it was kind of funny. In the Mexican-American War, a lot of the Mexican forces were actually sending letters to the Irish Americans who were fighting in the army and telling them, what are you doing fighting for these people? It's not your country. We're fellow Catholics and we go to the same church. So, take arms with our side. And so you actually had a lot of Irish people in the Mexican-American War just quit. They're like, oh, I got a point to that. Like walk off the job. And so that was a pretty bad problem. Well, a lot of them weren't even American citizens. A lot of them, they were just kind of like imported from Ireland. They're working in a factory. And they're like, hey, if you join the army, I'll pay you a little bit more. Like, oh, okay. And so that they do it. Not really, well, yeah. And it was just, what does anybody really know? Like to somebody in Ireland in the 1840s, Mexico was like literally on the other side of the world. They probably didn't know anything about it, So it was like, well, okay, yeah. and all the propaganda you're getting too is like, whoa, these people are doing these horrible things to us. We're going to defend ourselves. That always happens in every war. So, back to this. So, building the rails required filling hollows, blasting tunnels through mountains, and building bridges over rivers. So that's a lot of employment there. They had the benefit of increasing communication and trade throughout the country. And we're going to find that where the railroads go, so there's another invention, the telegraph. And so we're going to see that's another thing that's going to greatly help out the North. They have all the railroads, and wherever the Northern Army goes, they bring telegraph wire. So they're always able to have better communication than the South, where they're going to have mail carriers, secret messages, stuff like that. We're going to find in the Civil War that's going to be infiltrated. It's not going to help those Confederates out one bit. Trains allowed factories in the North to sell their goods and the Southern plantation owners to transport their produce. So remember that was one of the goals was originally it was the American system. We grow stuff in the South and you make it into something up north. One thing in the South, though, a lot of their economy isn't even going to have anything to do with the North. They're actually going to export a lot of that cotton and stuff they grow to places like England. And so it's going to be one of the reasons why they don't think they need the North. The steam engine primarily used coal for fuel and powered trains, factories, and steamboats. And so, yeah, like the invention of the steam engine, and we talked a little bit about that if I remember correctly. It's going to allow you to go both even upstream. Like steamboats were like a really deal. I mean, like even Mark Twain, he'd write so much about it because a steamboat was everything. You could make a lot of money if you were a salesman on one. People would go on them for their honeymoons. The things would have bars and you could gamble on them. All these things you couldn't do back at home. So it was just kind of like a wild, wild west. But the thing is, almost all of them would eventually blow up. Dangerous. The boiler rooms were notorious for eventually, one year or another, they're going to explode. So you probably don't want to be in one of the back rooms of the steamboat, because maybe it's going to be one of the ones that blow up. And there'd just be stories in the newspapers all the time. Well, the steamboat blew up. It killed immediately about 50 people. A couple more drowned. Everybody else had to swim on the edge of the Mississippi River. So it was just crazy. But hey, people go snorkeling with sharks too. Here's a choo-choo train map. So you see in the red, railroads built in 1850.
I'm also a choo-choo train.
Same, Joseph.
Yeah. So you see before the Civil War, look at all these railroads they have. But during
Joseph is a snake.
then you see 1850, 1860, so much more is going to expand up there. Like, look at North. That is just like a network. Railroads create Chicago. Chicago is going to become a major railroad hub. Same with St. Louis. And especially for the cattle industry. After the Civil War, you're going to have all these cattle herders just trying to bring them up to St. Louis so they could go up to the meat packing plants in Chicago, and they could go out east, feed all those people, but just don't have enough room.
Yeah, Chicago used to smell so bad. I mean, it probably still does smell pretty bad.
Huh?
But it used to smell like just grinded meat.
They had a lot of meat packing plants. Yeah, it was just a lot of animal pooping, slaughtering, stuff like that. And I'm sure it was pretty nasty. I'm sure it was really gross.
I read about it in The Devil in the White City.
Yeah, I mean, considering that's how it made its well. Yeah. But I mean,
Let's go.
all right, here. We'll do our last one for the day, I suppose. And well, here, let me see what number we're on to make sure we can make it through it on Monday.
Yeah, that some people think is Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, we'll do this one, and then that'll leave us with about 6 to do on Monday, and then we'll be ready for our test. So the cotton gin, you've all heard about the cotton gin. I mentioned that before. Invented by Eli Whitney in 1793. So as you see, like this is like 50, 60 years before what we were just talking about, but it's going to have implications for a couple of generations on just how you make money. And one of the reasons why cotton's going to be so tied to it. Because before the cotton gin, the little bowls that came out of these things had all these seeds that were really hard to pick out. And cotton in India was used for a long time. It was really labor intensive. You had to have somebody sit there, pick all the seeds out by hand before you could use the thread and put it in the loom to make some cloth. It was labor intensive, right? But with the turn of a hand crank, you could just churn out this stuff like ton after ton after ton with relatively no effort, really increasing the efficiency. And by increasing the efficiency, you make it into a cash-making commodity. The cotton gin made this process so simple that the cotton industry would boom. In the South, cotton grew easily because of the climate. After the War of 1812, the textile cloth-making industry grew in the North. Because of the profitability in cotton, the cotton gin may have contributed to the growth of slavery in the South. Of course, we know there's a lot of slavery in the South before this, but the expansion of the cotton industry is going to correlate with the expansion of slavery, because those were the people who were doing all of the planting and the picking and all the other labor that went along with it. So you can see how one led into another. And this and having these periods of economic expansion around one thing is really normal in a lot of economies. Like you had the tulip explosion in Europe before this. Once it was discovered how easily tulips could grow in Northern Europe, at first it was really profitable because people really liked the flowers, right? But the thing is, so many people started planting them is that their cost went down. Well, that might not be the best analogy, but think about like the explosion of like the app explosion. After the first iPhone came out, there was a lot of money to be made if you were an early app developer. Not quite as much now, but at first it was like crazy.
And that was like millions of apps.
Well, later on, we're going to talk about the oil explosion here in Texas. Like, it was just crazy. Like my grandfather's grandfather was an oil tycoon. Just by accident, found a bunch of oil, got super rich. You know, it's just.
You'd just be like digging in your field and it's.
Well, I don't know. They probably just owned the right property. But if you were like a wildcatter, what you would do is you'd buy some land and you would just dig on it, hoping to strike oil, like here in East Texas. Or you're like, hey, that farm, they got oil. So what you would do is you would dig and you would dig kind of like an angle under the ground to like steal their oil out of their property. So that was a big thing people did too. So
That's
Kilgore was a huge oil.
yeah, Kilgore. Kilgore was built because it was oil town. Same with Longview. Oil built those towns. In that part of East Texas, there's a lot of towns that were built from it. I think Palestine was around before the oil boom, but it grew with the oil boom. Yeah, Palestine was around back in the late early Republic. Tyler was around. I think Tyler was. I'm not sure when Tyler was founded, but it was around during the Civil War, because this was a big hub where people from, say, like Mississippi and Georgia would flee the fighting and come here, because Texas had relatively little fighting, especially up here. And so, in fact, a lot of there's I think names like Mary Tassett or something like that, a really famous journal. Like, she wrote a lot of journals. She was a plantation owner, and she was, I think her husband died, and so she came from the east to East Texas here in Tyler and settled here, and she brought all of her slaves with her. And so she was fleeing the Union Army because the Union Army was just freeing her slaves. And she's like, oh no. So somehow she got them over here. So
What?
yeah, so I don't know. I haven't read it. I only read like little bits of it. So I was like, oh man. Well, she lost them eventually. So she'd be very bitter about it the rest of her life, though. She will hate the North. She's going to be really into that whole thing. Like, we were such a great society until they messed it up, you know, so, which is going to be a really big thing. We'll talk about that during Reconstruction. All right, kids, that's going to end our lecture for today. We're going to finish up this mini unit on Monday and then have a test on Wednesday. It's going to be glorious. Bye. Got a house meeting today.